Oftentimes, I see students using tabs to tab out the chapters in their textbook, but this really isn't a worthwhile use of your time, because remember, the point of academic organization isn't to be pretty, it's not to be organized for the sake of being organized, it's to serve a practical purpose. So if your organization isn't giving you a benefit that outweighs the cost of the time and effort you spent doing the organization, then it's not really a practical use of your time. So what are some ways you can use tabs that are a little bit more helpful? You can use tabs to remind yourself to use resources. So that could be the old classic of throwing a tab on a page that has a chart that you want to remember to look at later. But it could also be a way to get yourself into the habit of using a resource you've never used before. So if you took my advice and made calendars with all your test dates at the start of the semester, you should probably put a tab in the binder where you're keeping them, because it's very common that students will do something like that and then forget to even look at it. I would also recommend putting a tab in the glossary and index of your textbook, because oftentimes if a student has a question, their first instinct is to go ask Dr. Google or Dr. TikTok or Dr. YouTube, but really you should check your textbook first, because there's a lot of different ways you can define things, and whatever you're finding on the general internet might not actually be appropriate for your course. You can also use tabs to reinforce key concepts. So for example, I tell students they should learn their gross and microanatomy and then their physiology. So making it a ritual where you get into the chapter that you're currently working on and figuring out, okay, here's the anatomy, here's the physiology, and separating it with tabs can help reinforce that concept of, okay, anatomy first, physiology second. Another thing you can consider doing is tabbing out big topics as you come across them. So you shouldn't do this ahead of time. This shouldn't be its own activity. But as you're reading, when you see a big heading and after you get through that big heading, write it on a tab and put it in your book so that at the end of the day, you have this list of topics poking out of your textbook to help reinforce, what am I actually even learning? What is the point of this chapter? It also gives you a way to evaluate how well you did while learning that day, because if you look at that list of topics poking out of your book and you can't start talking about them and all the things you learned about them, that's a sign that however you're reading your textbook is not working and you need to seek some advice on how to do that more effectively. You can also use tabs to designate parts of your notebook for specific things. If you're like me, those little cardboard dividers in your notebook might not be enough to stop you from just writing in any random part of your notebook, and marking out what part of your notebook you're using for your lab and your lecture could help prevent your notebook from devolving into chaos. And even if that's not an issue for you, you might want to designate the last 5 to 10 pages of your notebook for root words so that every time you learn a new one, you can jot it down back there. Once again, having that tab is going to remind you that root words are something that you should be looking at and learning and using. So this is the summary of the recommendations I've given you today. I hope there's something in here that you find useful that you can take with you. Have a great day and have fun learning.